The dust hung low in the late afternoon light, kicked up by boots and horses alike, drifting lazily across the shooting range as if it had nowhere else to be. Men in wide-brimmed hats and sun-bleached shirts leaned against the wooden railings, their arms crossed, their mouths twisted into smirks that carried the same weight as the heat pressing down on everyone's shoulders. The smell of gunpowder still lingered from the morning practice rounds, but now, with the competition about to begin, the air seemed thicker, heavier, full of that charged anticipation that made even seasoned shooters restless. Their rifles leaned against posts, polished and oiled, ready for the trial. 12 iron targets stood in a line against the backdrop of the hills, glinting faintly in the sun, daring anyone to take them down in record time. It was a test of speed and precision that had broken plenty of proud shooters before. And today, for the first time in the history of this small western town, a woman was stepping up to try. Her name was Claire Weston, though most of them didn't bother to use it. Around here she was the girl, the lady with ideas, or, more commonly, fool enough to think she can outshoot a man. She had been watching them train for weeks, sitting quietly at the edge of the range, learning the rhythm of the reloads, the twitch of their fingers, the way they counted breaths before pulling the trigger. She never asked for permission to stand among them, because she knew they would never give it. Instead, she simply showed up, a revolver at her side, and signed her name on the competition ledger with a confidence that turned heads and sparked whispers. At first, the Mockery came light-hearted, as if her presence were some kind of amusing distraction in a dull afternoon. But by the time she walked across the range and rested her palm against the railing, the laughter had sharpened. A tall man with a scar across his cheek spat tobacco juice onto the dirt and shook his head. "This ain't no place for skirts," he muttered loud enough for her to hear. Another chimed in, "Hope you got a steady hand for pouring tea, missy, 'cause you'll need more than that to hit steel." The laughter rippled outward, fueled by the hunger men often have when they smell weakness, and though she kept her expression unreadable, the fire in her chest burned hotter with each word. She had grown up hearing such voices. Her father had been a rancher who never let her ride anything faster than a mule, telling her horses were too spirited for women. Her brothers practiced with rifles while she was told to sew, to cook, to prepare for a husband she did not want. But when the ranch fell on hard times and her family's fortunes dwindled, it was her steady hand with a revolver that started bringing in meat for the table. At first it was rabbits, then coyotes threatening their cattle, and before long she could split a can at 30 yards without blinking. The skill came not from choice but from necessity, and necessity had a way of carving out sharper edges than leisure ever could. She learned because she had to, and because no one else believed she could. Still, the range today was a different battlefield. The rules of this contest were simple: 12 targets, 12 bullets, and the clock. The best time in town was held by Jesse Colburn, the scarred man who stood smirking at her now. He had cleared the line in 18 seconds flat, each bullet ringing steel with a speed that made the crowd roar. Claire had seen him shoot before. He was good, no doubt about it. But she also saw the flaws no one else noticed. The fraction of hesitation between his reloads, the way he exhaled too soon on his 7th shot, throwing his rhythm. She had been studying them all in silence, knowing that her moment would come. When the marshal called her name, the laughter swelled again, but she stepped forward with the steady gait of someone who had long ago decided that she would never turn back from a challenge. Her revolver was a Colt Navy, the same one her father had dismissed as too heavy for her small hands, but now it rested against her hip like it belonged to her more than anything else she owned. She felt its weight not as a burden but as a reminder. The sun was hot, the dust gritted between her teeth, and still she walked to the shooting mark, placed her boots on the worn planks and looked downrange. The 12 iron silhouettes stared back at her, each one daring her to fail. Somewhere behind her, she heard one of the men mutter, "She'll be lucky to hit 2 before she drops the damn thing." She ignored it. Instead, she inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the hot, dry air, and let her hand rest on the grip of her revolver. Her fingers brushed the familiar grooves of the handle, worn smooth by years of use, and she felt the comfort that came only from something that had been with her through hard seasons. Her heart was steady. Her mind was sharper than it had ever been. The marshal raised his hand. "Shooter ready?" "I'm ready," she said, her voice calm, steady, unshaken. "Stand by." Time seemed to stretch in the instant before the signal. The laughter behind her fell into the background, muted by the pounding rhythm of her heartbeat. All she saw were the targets. All she heard was her own breathing. And then, go. The world exploded into motion. Her hand flew to the revolver, drawing it with a smoothness that belied the hours she had spent practicing alone in the canyon where no one could laugh. The hammer cocked, the sight rose, and her first shot cracked across the range, slamming into the first target with a sharp clang. Before the echo faded, her wrist had shifted, the barrel already aligned with the second. Another crack, another clang. The rhythm built, smooth and relentless, her body moving as if the revolver was simply an extension of her will. Behind her, the mockery had stopped. The men who had laughed now leaned forward, their smirks replaced with something else, something closer to disbelief. The air was no longer filled with jeers but with the rapid succession of gunfire, each shot followed by the undeniable proof of steel ringing true. 1, 2, 3, 4. The targets fell in order, each struck faster than their eyes could follow. By the time she reached the seventh, she could feel the moment hanging on a knife's edge. This was where Jesse had faltered, where his breath had cost him a fraction of a second. She steadied, drew in a breath at exactly the right moment and fired. The bullet struck dead center, the clang echoing across the hills like a bell. There was no hesitation in her hands, no doubt in her eyes. The marshal's stopwatch ticked furiously, the crowd silent now, as though they feared even breathing too loudly might break the spell unfolding before them. The eighth target fell as though it had been waiting all along, the bullet hitting with such precision that the clang rang higher, cleaner than the rest. Claire barely heard it. Her mind was already locked on the ninth, her body moving with the kind of instinct that comes only when practice burns itself into muscle and bone. The revolver roared again, her wrist snapping in perfect alignment, the lead slicing through the dust-hazed air before slamming the iron plate square in the chest. The clang reverberated like a hammer against steel, and by now the silence from behind her was deafening. The 10th target waited on the far left, angled in such a way that most shooters lost momentum shifting back to it. Jesse Colburn himself had nearly stumbled on that one, losing precious time regaining his stance. Claire didn't stumble. Her boots dug into the wooden planks with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing where she stood not only on the range, but in the eyes of everyone who doubted her. She pivoted cleanly, cocked the hammer with a flick of her thumb and fired. The bullet screamed, the target clanged, and another piece of steel swayed back in defeat. 11. Almost there. She felt sweat bead along her temple, the revolver hot in her hand, but her grip did not falter. Her breath came steady, measured, each inhale and exhale timed to the rhythm of her shots. She had lived for this moment, not for the glory, not for their acceptance, but for herself. For every morning she had stolen an hour of practice before chores. For every whispered taunt that she'd never be strong enough, sharp enough, steady enough. For every woman in town told to sit quietly while the men took the stage. This moment was hers and hers alone. The barrel shifted, and the 11th target fell to the ground with a ringing cry. And then there was one. The 12th target stood farthest of all, barely catching the light, as though daring her to finish what she started. The revolver felt like it had grown heavier, the heat from the barrel searing her skin, but she ignored the burn. She inhaled once, deep and deliberate, her chest expanding against the leather of her vest. The world narrowed, every sound dimming until only the sight of that last target remained. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The crack tore through the silence, the recoil biting into her hand, the smell of gunpowder blooming sharp in her nostrils. The bullet struck dead center, the clang louder than all the rest, echoing across the hills with finality. Whoa! Her revolver hung in the air for a second longer before she lowered it, her shoulders steady, her face unreadable. For a heartbeat, the entire range seemed frozen. No cough, no shuffle, no laughter. Just silence, heavy and absolute, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Then the marshal, eyes wide, glanced down at the stopwatch clutched in his hand. He blinked once, twice, as though not trusting the numbers staring back at him. His mouth opened, closed, then finally opened again. 16 seconds, he announced, his voice carrying across the range like a bell tolling. The silence shattered. Gasps rippled through the crowd, disbelief breaking into scattered murmurs, and then into an uproar. Men who had mocked her were now standing with jaws slack, their arms fallen uselessly at their sides. Some shook their heads as if refusing to believe what they had seen. Others muttered excuses, theories that maybe the wind had been on her side, or the targets looser today. But the truth lay heavy in their eyes. She had done it. She had beaten Jesse Colburn's time. She had beaten every man's time. Jesse himself stood stiff, his scar twitching as he clenched his jaw. His hand rested on his own revolver, his knuckles pale against the grip. He didn't speak at first. His pride, built on years of being the fastest, the most reliable shot in town, had just been shattered by the woman he had called a fool minutes earlier. The laughter he had wielded like a weapon had turned to ash in his throat, and the only sound he could make was a sharp exhale that betrayed the storm brewing inside him. Claire holstered her revolver with a fluid motion, the weight of it settling against her hip like a final punctuation mark. She did not gloat, did not smile, did not even look at the men behind her. She kept her eyes on the steel targets swaying softly in the breeze, as though reminding herself this had never been about them. It had been about proving, to herself most of all, that she could stand in the very place they told her she didn't belong and win. But the crowd wasn't finished. A voice broke out, "No way, she's faster than Jessie." Another shouted, "Run it again. Prove it weren't luck." The murmurs swelled into an argument, men calling for her to repeat, others defending the marshal's count. The marshal raised his hands for silence, his expression stern. "The time is the time," he said firmly. 16 seconds. No dispute. The crowd fell uneasy, their disbelief refusing to settle into acceptance. Jesse stepped forward, his boots grinding against the dirt. He looked at Claire, his eyes cold, a sneer twisting across his face. "One time don't make you the best, girl. You think you're something special, 'cause you got lucky with 12 shots. His voice was low, dangerous, carrying the weight of pride wounded and ego bleeding. Claire finally turned her gaze on him. Her eyes, calm and steady, locked with his. "Luck didn't put those bullets where I wanted them," she said evenly. "Practice did. And I don't need to prove it twice." A murmur rippled through the crowd at her words, some nodding, others bristling. Jesse's sneer deepened, but before he could speak again, the marshal stepped between them. "Enough. The rules are the rules. She signed her name. She shot her round. And she holds the time now." He looked at Claire with something almost like respect. Fastest anyone's ever cleared the range. The declaration hung in the air, undeniable, unshakable. The crowd shifted, whispers spilling from one man to another, and though disbelief lingered, there was no undoing what they had witnessed. The steel had sung for her, and the stopwatch had spoken. For the first time, Claire allowed herself a small smile, though not for the men around her. It was for herself, for the hours no one had seen, for the battles she had fought in silence long before stepping foot on the range. The weight of the revolver at her side was no longer just a weapon, it was proof. Proof that she belonged. Proof that she had always belonged. The crowd lingered even after the marshal's voice faded, the energy on the range like a thunderstorm that had cracked but hadn't yet rolled away. Some men walked in tight circles, shaking their heads, muttering to themselves as if turning the scene over and over might change the outcome. Others leaned on the rails with their mouths still half open, stunned by the speed of what they'd seen. A few had already left, their pride too fragile to remain in the presence of a woman who had outdone them. The sun hung lower, gilding the dust in gold, and Claire could feel every eye still pinned to her back. It wasn't just the men. From the edge of the range, half hidden in the shadow of the stables, women had gathered, wives, daughters, sisters, most of them with aprons still dusted in flour or dirt from chores. They had not been invited to watch, but they had come anyway, drawn by whispers of the challenge. Claire caught their eyes now, some wide with shock, others lit with something fiercer. A few smiled, though it was tentative, cautious, as if afraid to be caught celebrating. Claire held their gaze for a heartbeat and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The connection was brief, but it sparked something between them, like a flame hidden under the coals. Jesse Colburn was not ready to let the matter rest. He stalked forward, his boots heavy in the dirt, his scarred face red with fury. He stopped just short of Claire, the marshal still between them, but the tension crackled like a gun about to fire. "You don't understand," he growled, jabbing a finger toward her. "You're playing a game you don't belong in. This range, this contest, it's been ours. Think you can waltz in here and take it? You humiliate me in front of the whole damn town, and you think I'll just let it stand?" The marshal shifted, keeping a hand out as if to hold Jesse back. "You had your turn, Jesse. She had hers. You both knew the rules." But Jesse's pride had never been bound by rules. He leaned forward, his voice dropping low enough that only Claire and a few near them could hear. "You may have beaten me on paper, girl, but I'll have my time. One way or another, I'll make sure no one remembers your little show." Claire didn't flinch. She met his stare head-on, her voice quiet but steady. "Maybe that's what frightens you, Jesse, that they'll remember me. That no one will forget who you lost to." The words sliced deeper than any bullet. Jesse's nostrils flared, his jaw clenched, and for a dangerous second, it looked as if his hand might fly to the revolver at his side. The marshal's palm pressed firmly to Jesse's chest, halting him. "Don't," the marshal warned, his voice hard. "Not here. Not now." Murmurs swelled in the crowd again, some urging Jesse on, others whispering that he'd already lost more than enough. Claire stood unmoving, her face carved from resolve. She knew what she risked saying those words, but backing down now would undo everything she had just won. The silence of women watching from the edges was louder to her than all the mutters of the men. She could not afford to falter. At last, Jesse spat to the side, the taste of defeat bitter on his tongue. He turned sharply, shoving past the marshal, and stalked toward the far end of the range. The crowd parted for him, but no one cheered, no one clapped him on the shoulder as they once might have. His shadow fell long behind him, and though his pride kept him upright, the hollowness in his step betrayed him. When he was gone, the marshal finally lowered his hand and turned toward Claire. "You best be careful," he said quietly though not unkindly. "Men like him don't let go easy." Claire nodded once. "I didn't expect him to." She walked from the firing line, then each step deliberate, steady. The weight of the Colt Navy at her hips seemed heavier than before, but not with fatigue. It was heavy with meaning. The murmurs followed her, some still sharp with disbelief, others tinged with reluctant respect. A few men, older ones mostly, tipped their hats to her as she passed, though quickly, as if ashamed to be seen doing it. But the eyes that mattered most were still at the edge of the stables. The women hadn't left. They stood close together now, whispering among themselves, stealing glances at her. When Claire passed near, one of them, an older woman with gray in her hair and flowers still dusting her apron, stepped forward just enough to speak. "You showed him," she said softly, her voice trembling but fierce. "Lord help me, you showed 'em all." Claire paused only long enough to nod, then kept walking, her throat too tight for words. She felt the weight of those whispers behind her, the quiet awe, the fragile but growing hope. She hadn't come here to be anyone's symbol, but whether she wanted it or not, that's what she had become. By the time she reached the edge of town, the sun had dipped low enough to paint the horizon in streaks of red and gold. The street was quieter than usual, the news of what had happened on the range spreading ahead of her like wildfire. People stood in doorways, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of her as she passed. Some scowled openly, their pride bruised by her defiance of the order they had always known. Others said nothing, but their eyes followed her with something new, something she had never seen directed her way before. Respect. When she reached the small boarding house where she rented a room, she closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a long moment, the silence pressing down hard. She had done it. She had beaten them. But victory was never without its price. Jesse Colburn's threat echoed in her ears, and she knew enough of men like him to believe it wasn't just idle talk. Tomorrow or the next day he would strike back, whether with words, fists, or bullets she couldn't yet say. She unbuckled her gun belt and laid the revolver on the small wooden table by her bed. Her hand lingered on it, fingers brushing the handle, and she whispered quietly to herself, "One day at a time." It was the only way to face what was coming. Outside, the town buzzed with gossip, the name Claire Weston passing from mouth to mouth, carried by disbelief, anger, admiration, and fear. And though she sat alone in her room, staring at the revolver, she knew the truth. Nothing in this town would ever be the same again. By the following morning, the story of what had happened on the range was no longer confined to the men who had witnessed it. It had traveled along the dusty streets, seeped into saloons and shops, and rolled across kitchen tables. By dawn, every corner of town seemed to hum with one name, spoken in tones that ranged from disbelief to pride to outright fury: Claire Weston. Shopkeepers repeated the tale to customers like it was gospel, children reenacted her shots with sticks in the dirt, and women spoke of her in hushed tones over laundry lines, their voices carrying a strange new kind of energy. Jesse Colburn had not been idle. Word spread just as quickly that he had left the range without a word to anyone, his pride trailing behind him like smoke. But by evening he was back in the saloon, his voice loud, his glass never empty, and the men around him leaning in to soak up every bitter word. He told them it wasn't a fair count, that the marshal must have had reason to favor her, that her revolver must have been tampered with. Each excuse drew nods from those unwilling to accept that one of their own could be bested, and even more unwilling to accept that it had been by a woman. But beneath Jesse's bluster, there was something darker, something far less about excuses and far more about vengeance. He couldn't abide being remembered as the man who'd been beaten. Claire felt it in the air when she stepped out into town. The stares were sharper, the whispers louder. Men she passed muttered into their beards, some with mock laughter, others with scorn. 16 seconds sure, one sneered as she walked past, but let's see if she can stand her ground when the game's real. A different man muttered, doesn't matter how fast she shoots, still just a woman. Yet, for every voice like that, there was another that stayed silent too long, a pause in a conversation as she passed, a glance that lingered with something harder to define. Not all the looks were hostile. An older man who ran the feed store tipped his hat at her, his expression unreadable but deliberate. A young boy ran up with wide eyes, blurting out, "Was it true you cleared 'em all? All 12? Faster than anyone?" Before his mother yanked him away, her face pale, whispering sharply in his ear as she pulled him into the safety of the crowd. Claire said nothing, but the boy's face stayed with her long after he'd gone. That evening she returned to the range alone. The targets had been reset, lined up in their silent row, and the last streaks of sunlight painted them crimson. She set her revolver on the railing, checked the chamber, and began again. One by one she fired, her shots ringing in the empty air. There was no stopwatch, no crowd, no marshal, just the rhythm she had practiced for years. The clang of steel reassured her, a steady voice cutting through the uncertainty that had grown since yesterday. She had won, yes, but victories were fleeting. Pride didn't fade quietly, and Jessie's pride was bigger than most. From the corner of her eye she noticed movement. A figure leaned against the fence near the edge of the range. It was Martha, the woman who had spoken to her after the contest, flour still dusting her apron even now. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood two other women, younger, their eyes bright in the fading light. They didn't come closer, but they didn't leave either. They just stood watching. Claire finished her 12th shot, holstered her revolver, and gave them a nod. Martha lifted her chin in return, a silent acknowledgement that spoke louder than words. Back in town, Jesse's plotting grew more dangerous. The saloon became his pulpit, his bitterness spilling into threats. "If she thinks she can take my place, she's got another thing coming," he barked one night, slamming his glass down hard enough to crack it. "This ain't just about targets. Out there's the real world, bandits, rustlers, worse. You think she'll stand up to that? She'll fold. And when she does, I'll be the one standing tall again." Some men laughed nervously, others nodded eagerly, and a few stayed quiet, their eyes betraying unease. They knew Jesse well enough to realize his words weren't just talk. Claire began to feel the isolation. The boarding house keeper grew curt, as if worried that housing her might stir trouble. At the general store, two women whispered as she passed, not with admiration but fear. Fear of what Jesse or the men might do, fear of being seen on her side. For every Martha who looked at her with pride, there were three others who turned away, afraid of what change might mean. But Claire had long ago learned to stand alone. She carried herself the same way she had on the range, her stride steady, her gaze unyielding. And slowly, bit by bit, cracks began to show in the walls around her. A young girl came to her one morning, shyly handing her a ribbon and saying, "Mama says I should give this to the fastest in town." A man at the blacksmith's shop muttered, "Fine shooting, miss," before quickly turning back to his work. The world didn't shift all at once, but it was shifting, however slowly. Late one evening, as Claire cleaned her revolver by lamplight, a knock came at her door. She hesitated, hand instinctively reaching for the weapon before she rose. When she opened the door, the marshal stood there, hat in his hand, his face drawn with concern. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside and he entered, setting his hat on the table. For a long moment, he said nothing, only looking at her with the kind of weariness that came from years of trying to keep order where tempers always ran hotter than reason. Finally he spoke. "You shook things up, Claire. More than you realize. Jesse's not just riled, he's dangerous. He's got men behind him and they're talking of settling this outside the range. I can keep the law in town, but once you step beyond it," he trailed off, his meaning clear. Claire set her revolver down and folded her arms. "So what do you want me to do? Step back? Pretend it never happened?" The marshal shook his head. "I'm not asking you to back down. I'm telling you to be ready. You've proven yourself on the range. Now you might have to prove yourself somewhere else." The lamplight flickered between them, shadows dancing on the walls. Claire's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed steady. "I've been ready my whole life. If Jesse wants a fight, he'll find out quick enough I don't scare easy." The marshal studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Just be careful. Pride and hate make men reckless. Reckless men make towns bleed." With that he took his hat, tipped it to her and left. When the door closed, Claire sat alone again, staring at the Colt Navy resting on the table. The revolver gleamed in the lamplight, a symbol of both her victory and the danger it had stirred. Outside, the town carried on, its whispers growing louder, its tension mounting. And somewhere in the dark, Jesse Colburn was waiting, his anger sharpening into something that would not be contained by words alone. The sun had risen higher over the rugged hills by the time Clara was ready for the next test. The whispers around camp had shifted from cruel mockery to curious speculation. Men who had once laughed at her were now watching with a mix of unease and respect. The captain had made it clear, if she wanted a place among them she had to prove herself not once, not twice but consistently. One lucky run at the range wasn't enough. To these hardened cowhands and sharpshooters, consistency was the measure of skill, and reliability was the measure of trust. Clara knew it and she welcomed the challenge. She stood at the edge of the open field where a series of targets had been set up in staggered lines. Unlike the simple circle targets from before, these were moving rigs, swinging, turning, some even rolling down tracks to simulate the speed of running bandits. The men had faced this test many times and few could do it well. To miss even one target was enough for a night of teasing from the rest of the crew. Clara ran her fingers over the polished grip of her revolver, her mind quiet. She had spent the night cleaning it, oiling the cylinder until it turned as smooth as silk. Her rifle rested against her shoulder, its wooden stock worn but reliable. These weren't just tools to her, they were proof that her skill was earned, not borrowed. The captain raised a hand. You all doubted her before. Now we see what she can really do. His eyes flicked to Clara. You ready? Her chin lifted. Always. A bell rang out, sharp against the morning air, and the first target swung into motion. Clara's revolver was up before most of the men even realized she had drawn. One shot cracked, the swinging board jolted, and a puff of dust confirmed the hit. Another target rolled out from behind a barrel, faster, smaller. She pivoted her stance, knees bent, breath steady, and fired twice. Both bullets struck the moving shape before it could roll past the line. The men muttered among themselves, surprised by her speed. But the test didn't slow. A third target jerked from the shadows, metal plates rattling as it wove left and right. Clara holstered her revolver in one smooth motion and lifted her rifle. Her cheek pressed to the stock, the barrel tracked the motion and she squeezed the trigger once, the bullet snapping through the air. The target spun as it was hit dead center. She didn't waste a second. Another target shot up from the ground, high and sudden like an ambush. She reloaded instinctively, pulled the rifle tight and struck it down before it could swing back. By now the men had gone silent. Even those who had mocked her the loudest were standing stiff, eyes wide, jaws clenched. They weren't seeing luck anymore. They weren't seeing a fluke. They were seeing discipline, training, and a natural ability sharpened by countless hours she had never boasted about. Still the test grew harder. A pair of targets were released together, one fast, one slow, meant to trip shooters into focusing on the wrong speed. Clara inhaled once, calm and unshaken, and dropped the fast one with her revolver, then turned the rifle upward and nailed the slower one with a single controlled shot. Dust rose from the hit as the captain's eyebrows lifted. Not many of his men could have timed that so cleanly. But then came the hardest challenge. A long-distance target rolling down the farthest track, barely visible against the slope of the hill. Clara's revolver was useless at that range. She adjusted her grip on the rifle, blocking out the murmurs behind her, the weight of the moment pressing like heat on her shoulders. She waited for her breath to still, aimed just above where the rolling target would cross and fired. The bullet cracked through the open air, echoing across the hills, and a second later the faraway shape shuddered and fell flat. For a heartbeat there was nothing. No one spoke, no one breathed. Then the silence broke into voices, shouts, disbelief, curses muttered under breath. A few men clapped their hands against their thighs in frustration, while others just shook their heads in amazement. Clara lowered her rifle slowly, calm as if she had done nothing extraordinary. The captain's gaze was fixed on her. 12 targets, moving, shifting, rolling, he said slowly. Every single one cleared. Faster and cleaner than any man here has done in months. His voice carried, his authority heavy. Tell me, men, do you still call her a fool? Do you still think she's a joke? No one answered. The same mouths that had once mocked her now stayed closed, tight with either shame or grudging respect. Clara looked around at them, her eyes steady. You don't have to like me, she said, her voice even. But don't mistake me again. I came here to earn my place, not to beg for it. Her words settled over the group like dust after gunfire. She turned away from the targets, her revolver back in its holster, her rifle resting against her shoulder. For the first time since she arrived, no one dared to laugh. Later, as the men dispersed, Clara caught sight of a few pairs of eyes still on her. Some carried anger at being shown up, some carried doubt, but more than a few carried something new, respect, reluctant but real. Among them was a younger cowboy, no older than 20, who had smirked at her on the first day. He approached, hesitant, scratching the back of his neck. Ma'am, he said awkwardly, That was damn impressive. Clara gave him a faint smile. Impressive doesn't matter unless it counts for something. He nodded, unsure what to say, and stepped back. The camp carried on with its work, but she knew things had changed. The range was no longer filled with mockery, it was filled with silence, with thought, with men reconsidering everything they thought they knew. And Clara knew the truth. This was only the beginning. Proving herself once had won their attention, proving herself twice had forced their respect, but the real challenge was yet to come. To keep her place, to truly belong, she would have to show them again and again that her skill was not a trick, not a story to fade with the morning. It would have to become undeniable. She welcomed it. Because she hadn't come this far just to survive their judgment. She had come to rise above it, and to stand taller than anyone had ever expected her to. The morning sun rose like a molten coin above the wide range, painting the scrubland with strokes of copper and gold. A soft breeze pushed dust across the open field, carrying with it the faint tang of gun oil and powder residue from the previous day's trials. Claire stood at the edge of the range with her rifle slung across her shoulder, her boots planted firm in the dirt, her mind sharpened to a razor's edge. The mockery that had once echoed like a chorus in this place had grown quieter, now replaced with whispers of awe, and though she carried herself with calm poise, her heart understood the weight of the reputation she was building. Winning once might have been a fluke in their eyes, but to keep winning, to prove herself over and over, required grit, discipline, and a kind of endurance few men on that range could match. She was ready to prove it again today. The organizers of the regional competition had expanded the challenge after her last victory, perhaps to humble her, perhaps to test the limits of every shooter who dared step forward. Instead of 12 targets, there would be 15, each placed at varying distances, some partially obscured by barriers, others requiring precision under shifting wind. The range had been reshaped into something more like a battlefield than a shooting gallery, forcing competitors to adjust positions, reload under pressure, and think as much with their minds as with their reflexes. When Claire walked the line, surveying the spread of targets, she caught men glancing at her in quick, sidelong ways, as though afraid to meet her gaze but unable to look away. Some of them still muttered quietly, voices thick with resentment, but even in their whispers there was less laughter now, more unease. Her main rival, a man named Carter Briggs, leaned against his rifle case a few yards down, his lips twisted into something between a sneer and a smile. Carter had been the local favorite for years, a man with a reputation for speed, accuracy, and a sharp tongue. He had watched his standing crumble when Claire beat him clean the first time, and though he congratulated her with stiff politeness then, his pride had been wounded deeply. Now he eyed her as if she were an intruder in his kingdom, a usurper who had stolen his crown. "Hope you enjoyed the spotlight while it lasted," he said as she passed, his voice low and oily, "because today you're going to need more than luck." Claire didn't pause, didn't grant him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, she checked her rifle, polished metal gleaming in the early light, and adjusted the strap across her shoulder. Her silence unsettled him more than any retort could have. The first shooters stepped onto the range one by one, their performances setting the bar for the day. Dust plumed as boots pounded the dirt, brass casings scattered like confetti after each round, and the air filled with the sharp crack of shots echoing off the barren hills. Some men impressed with their speed, hitting most of the targets in rapid succession, though a few missed under pressure. Others tried too hard, fumbling reloads or losing rhythm midway. Claire watched each run intently, not to measure herself against them, but to understand the rhythm of the wind, the timing of the officials' calls, the way the course demanded both patience and aggression. When Carter took his turn, the crowd leaned forward, hungry for a show. He didn't disappoint at first. His rifle barked like thunder, his movements fluid and practiced, his bullets striking steel with harsh, ringing clarity. He tore through the first 10 targets like a storm, but on the 11th he stumbled, reloading too fast, jamming his weapon for a crucial second. Though he recovered and finished with respectable speed, the hesitation left a scar on his time. He stepped off the line with a forced grin, but his eyes flickered toward Claire with desperate defiance. When her name was called, the entire range seemed to hold its breath. Claire stepped forward with measured calm, every movement deliberate, every thought aligned with the singular task before her. She could feel the weight of eyes on her, both doubting and admiring, but she let it all fade into silence as she settled into position. The rifle felt like an extension of her body, the cool steel stock against her cheek grounding her in the moment. The signal sounded, sharp and final, and she moved. Her first 3 shots rang out like clockwork, each target snapping in response with a satisfying clang. She shifted smoothly, no wasted movement, no hesitation. Dust swirled around her boots as she advanced to the next position, reloading with a fluid motion that seemed choreographed yet instinctive. The fourth, fifth, and sixth targets fell in rapid succession, her breathing steady, her eyes scanning ahead before each trigger pull. The crowd murmured as she advanced through the midline. There was no stumble, no wasted second, only precision married to speed. On the eighth target, the wind gusted suddenly, tugging at her shot, but she adjusted in a fraction of a second, compensating and striking true. She crouched low for the ninth and 10th, bullets tearing through metal with sharp finality. By the time she rose for the 11th, the energy of the range had shifted entirely. The whispers of Mockery had dissolved into odd silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic report of her rifle. Carter, watching from the side, felt his stomach tighten with dread. This was no accident, no beginner's luck. This was mastery unfolding before his eyes. The final 5 targets stood across uneven ground, designed to break concentration and force mistakes. Claire took them methodically, her movements calm even as adrenaline coursed through her veins. She didn't rush, didn't overreach, but executed each step with surgical precision. The 12th target clanged, then the 13th, the sound echoing like the toll of a bell. The 14th fell moments later, the shot perfectly timed between gusts of wind. At the last target, she inhaled deeply, centered herself, and let the world narrow into the alignment of her sights. One breath, one squeeze, one strike. The final clang reverberated across the range like thunder rolling across distant hills. Her rifle lowered slowly, deliberately, and silence filled the air before erupting into thunderous applause. She had done it again, not only clearing the course but doing so faster than anyone had yet managed that day. The officials compared times, checked their records, and confirmed what the crowd already knew. Claire had beaten Carter, had beaten them all, with a performance that carried the weight of inevitability. As the cheers rose around her, she caught sight of Carter's face, pale with anger, his jaw tight, his pride shattered anew. But beyond him she saw others, men and women alike, looking at her with something more powerful than jealousy or disdain. They looked at her with respect, with recognition of a skill that could not be denied. Claire stood tall, dust swirling around her boots, the sun warm on her shoulders, her rifle steady at her side. For the second time she had silenced the laughter with steel and resolve, and for the first time she sensed that the range itself had shifted. No longer a place of mockery, it was now her proving ground, and no one could take that away from her. The following morning dawned with the faintest glow of orange stretching across the plains, the sun creeping slowly over the ridge lines that bordered the town. Claire awoke before most of the others, her body already accustomed to the rhythm of training and long hours of practice. She sat at the edge of her small bunk in the barracks the sheriff had lent her, fingers idly brushing over the polished wood of her rifle stock. Each groove, each tiny mark of wear, told a piece of the journey she had carried it through. Her long rides, her lonely hours at distant ranges, and now this looming contest that had grown from a local spectacle into something much larger. The town had been buzzing with word that challengers from distant counties and even some renowned guns from the state would be riding in for the grand shootout. What once had been mockery directed at Claire now shifted into sharp-eyed speculation. Could she truly hold her ground against legends of the range? Or had her victory been nothing more than a lucky fluke? These questions floated everywhere she went, though fewer dared to say them aloud in her presence. The mocking laughter had vanished, replaced by a silence heavy with respect and doubt in equal measure. She stepped outside with her rifle cradled lightly in her arms. The crisp air filled her lungs as she glanced toward the practice posts set out by the sheriff's deputies the night before. Metal plates gleamed faintly in the rising sun, lined in rows and staggered distances, ready to test any shooter who wished to prove themselves. Claire adjusted her stance, squared her shoulders, and drew in a steadying breath. One by one, shots cracked through the morning silence, echoing against the mountains. Each impact rang out clear and sharp, the kind of sound that spoke of certainty. She moved through the plates with methodical precision, her rhythm constant, her aim never wavering. By the time the last plate spun from her bullet, sweat had gathered along her temples despite the chill of dawn. She lowered the rifle, exhaling, and allowed herself a small smile. She was ready, though she knew the battle ahead was as much in the minds of the spectators as it was in her own accuracy. When the town began to stir, she found herself approached by a small group of young girls who carried notebooks and wide eyes. They had been trailing her for days, shyly watching from behind fences and stalls, whispering to one another every time she passed. Today, however, they found the courage to stand before her. "Miss Claire," one of them said nervously, clutching her notebook like it was a shield, "could you show us how to stand? Like you do when you shoot?" The question startled her for a moment. She glanced down at their eager faces, each one glowing with admiration, and then she crouched slightly to meet their eyes. She demonstrated her stance carefully, patient in her explanations, letting them mimic the way her feet set against the ground, how her shoulders leaned just so, how she breathed steady before raising an invisible rifle. Their giggles and wide smiles lit something inside her chest, something warmer than even victory could provide. For the first time, she realized her success had already grown beyond herself. She had become something the town's children looked up to, a figure that reshaped what was possible for them. The thought steadied her even more than practice could. By afternoon, riders began arriving. The distant dust trails turned into dark figures, men and women mounted on lean horses, rifles strapped to their sides. They dismounted with a presence that carried weight, the kind of weight earned from years of contests and victories. Some of the names were spoken in hushed tones around the saloons. Dalton Briggs, the crack shot from the Northern Territories, Amelia Crane, who had never missed a moving target in open-range contests, and Hollis Kane, a broad-shouldered figure with a reputation for speed that defied belief. Each arrival drew the townsfolk from their homes, forming circles around the new challengers, eager to glimpse the ones who would test their new heroine. Claire watched from the sidelines, her hands never far from her rifle, her expression calm though her heart quickened at the sight of them. She had asked for this, in a way. By proving herself once, she had opened the door to all who would come prove her wrong. And yet she felt no dread. Instead, she felt a strange exhilaration, the kind of fire that burned only when a person knew they were walking directly into the storm that would decide their future. That evening, the sheriff gathered everyone at the range grounds to announce the structure of the competition. Torches lined the area, casting long shadows across the dirt as the townsfolk huddled close to hear his words. "Tomorrow," he said, voice carrying over the crowd, "we host the greatest contest this town has ever seen. The rules are simple: accuracy first, speed second. Targets at varying distances, some stationary, some moving. Each shooter will face the course, and the one who clears it fastest with the fewest misses will take the prize." His eyes fell briefly on Claire, and he nodded as if reminding her of the weight she carried. Around her, murmurs rose like wind through dry grass. Bets were already being whispered. Lines were being drawn in conversations. Everyone wanted to know, would Claire hold her crown, or would one of the legends ride away with it? Claire returned to her quarters late, but sleep would not come easy. She lay awake, listening to the distant voices of revelers in the saloons, the clinking of glasses, the laughter of men who thought tomorrow would break her resolve. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts chasing themselves in restless circles. Doubt pricked at the edges of her confidence, whispering of the skill these challengers carried, of the sheer weight of their reputations. But then she remembered the girls who had mimicked her stance earlier that day, their hopeful faces shining with belief. She remembered the sheriff's trust, the town's shifting respect, and most of all, the long hours she had carved from loneliness, training with no one to applaud, no one to guide her but her own discipline. That, she realized, was her advantage. These legends had names, stories, victories, but she had perseverance forged from solitude, and no one could take that away. With that thought, her breathing steadied and eventually her eyes closed. Morning came again, this time with a heavy hush that blanketed the entire town. People moved toward the range in near silence, the anticipation pressing down on them. Claire walked among them, her rifle slung across her back, her stride unhurried yet firm. The air crackled with tension as if the earth itself held its breath. She could feel the eyes on her, some heavy with doubt, others with expectation, many with wonder. But she did not falter. When she reached the range and placed her rifle on the table, she ran her fingers along its stock once more and whispered to herself, "Let them come." The desert air was quiet now, so different from the chaos that had once filled the range. Where once there had been mocking laughter, now there was reverent silence, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind moving through the tall grass at the edge of the field. Elena stood with her rifle resting against her shoulder, her chest rising and falling as she drew in slow breaths, letting the moment sink in. It wasn't just about the target she had hit or the speed with which she had surpassed everyone. It was about what she had proven, to herself, to those who doubted her, and to the land that had shaped her strength. All around, the men who once laughed at her shifted awkwardly, their earlier confidence dissolved into something more humble. They had seen her skill, undeniable and sharp, and for the first time in years, respect outweighed prejudice in their eyes. Sheriff McBride stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dusty ground. His gruff voice carried authority, but even that edge softened as he spoke. "Reckon I've seen more shooters in my day than I can count, but what you did here, no one's come close. Not in speed, not in precision. You've set a new standard." His words, though simple, echoed with the weight of acknowledgement. Around him, others nodded, the shift in their expressions more telling than any applause could have been. Elena met his gaze briefly, then looked down, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She didn't need their praise, but it was a balm after years of dismissive sneers. Beyond the range, the sun had dipped lower, setting the sky ablaze with shades of orange and violet. The air shimmered with heat, but Elena felt a strange calm inside her, as though the storm she had carried all her life was finally beginning to quiet. She thought of her father, who had once guided her hands when she was too small to hold the rifle steady, his voice patient as he reminded her that skill was not about strength but about focus. His memory carried her now, standing tall in front of all who had thought her unworthy. She whispered under her breath, so soft only she could hear it, "I did it, Papa." A young deputy approached hesitantly, no longer sneering like he had earlier in the day. His tone was almost shy. "Ma'am, would you mind showing me that trick you did with your breathing? I couldn't believe how steady you were." Elena looked at him, and instead of scorn, she offered the faintest nod. "It's not a trick," she said evenly. "It's patience. Learn to listen to the silence between your breaths, and the rifle will follow." He absorbed her words like scripture, and she realized that her victory wasn't only about silencing Mockery, it was about changing minds, about opening the door for others to see that strength came in many forms. The night crept closer, lanterns being lit one by one along the wooden posts near the saloon and range. Townsfolk gathered still, some whispering about the contest, others replaying the shots in their minds, amazed at how quickly she had moved, how unerring her aim had been. Stories were already being spun, some exaggerating, some faithful, but all carrying her name with a new weight. Where she had once been dismissed as "that girl with the rifle," now they spoke of her as a legend in the making. It was strange to hear, but she did not flinch from it. She knew legends could inspire, and maybe that was her true role now. Later, in the quiet corner of the saloon, she sat with a glass of water in front of her, too tired to indulge in stronger drink. A few men walked by, their eyes lowering respectfully, their hats tipped. She returned the gesture with a calm nod. Sheriff McBride joined her briefly, lowering himself into the chair opposite her. "You've done something more than just shoot targets today," he said, his eyes sharp but kind. "You've reminded us that skill ain't bound by gender, that respect has to be earned on merit, not assumption. This town needed that lesson." Elena didn't answer right away, but she held his gaze steadily, appreciating the rare honesty in his tone. Finally she said, "They'll forget if no one keeps proving it. One day of victory isn't enough to change years of thought." McBride chuckled, a low rumble. "Maybe. But they won't forget you. And that's the start." When she finally left the saloon, the sky was filled with stars, countless pinpricks of light spread across the endless black canvas. She stood for a moment in the open street, breathing in the night air. The town seemed different now, less hostile, more open, but she knew challenges still waited. There would always be those unwilling to accept, always those clinging to old beliefs. But tonight had shown her that Mockery could be silenced not by words, not by arguments, but by undeniable proof. And she had delivered that proof in 12 perfect shots. The next morning, the range was nearly empty when she returned, rifle in hand. Only a few curious onlookers lingered, and one boy, no older than 12, approached timidly. He held a worn wooden toy rifle, clearly carved by hand. "Miss Elena," he said softly, could you show me how to shoot? I want to be fast like you." She crouched down, her expression softening in a way few had ever seen. "Fast will come later," she told him gently. "First you learn to be steady. Hold it like this." She adjusted his hands carefully, her patience the same as her father's had once been. Watching the boy's eyes light up, she realized her victory was planting seeds. Seeds of change, of inspiration, of a future where skill would matter more than prejudice. As the day went on, she practiced again, not for the crowd, not for the recognition, but for herself. Each shot was a reminder of the journey she had endured, each target another barrier broken. She thought of the voices that once mocked her, and how silent they had become. She thought of the respect she now carried, and how heavy it might become. But above all, she thought of the freedom she had found, the freedom of standing tall, unshaken, and true to herself. By evening, as the sun sank once more and the desert stretched wide and endless, Elena knew this was not the end of her story. This was only the beginning. She had shown them all what she was capable of, but greater challenges would surely rise. Yet she welcomed them now with no fear and no hesitation. Because she carried with her something stronger than doubt, stronger than mockery. She carried the proof of who she was, etched forever in the sound of 12 perfect shots that still echoed in the memory of all who had watched. And in that quiet certainty she smiled. For the first time in years, it was not a smile of defiance but of peace. The end.